हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू अवर चैनल। इस वीडियो में पढ़ने वाले हैं एक्यूट इन्फ्लेमेशन के बारे में। इन द लास्ट वीडियो वी डिस्कस्ड हाउ वी क्लासिफाइड द इन्फ्लेमेशन टू टू कैटेगरीज, दैट वाज द एक्यूट इन्फ्लेमेशन एंड द क्रॉनिक इन्फ्लेमेशन। If the inflammation is of shorter duration, we call it as acute inflammation, and if the inflammation is for longer duration, it is called the chronic inflammation. So in this video we'll basically focusing on the acute inflammation and what are the changes that occurs in the acute inflammation. So acute inflammation is basically we have to study about the vascular changes and the cellular changes. In the cellular changes, again we have two categories: intravascular cellular changes and the extravascular cellular changes. See, whenever there is inflammation, there may be changes taking place in the blood vessels, or there may change take place in the cells. Now again we have the cells divided into two categories: the cells which are present inside the blood vessels, that may be the WBCs or the platelets or the endothelium lining which is lining the blood vessels, or the cells which are present inside the tissues. So that's why we have divided the cellular changes into two categories: intravascular part and the extravascular part which is present inside the tissue. In total 4 वैस्कुलर इवेंट्स हैं जिनके बारे में हमें पढ़ना है, मेजर वैस्कुलर इवेंट्स। एंड सेलुलर चेंजेस में इन टोटल वी हैव 10 विच इज़ फर्दर डिवाइडेड इनटू इंट्रावैस्कुलर पार्ट एंड द एक्स्ट्रावैस्कुलर पार्ट। तो हम इसके बाद जब डिटेल में पढ़ेंगे तो हम डिवाइड कर देंगे किस में कितने इवेंट्स होते हैं। सो दिस आर बेसिकली द मेजर इवेंट्स, दे मे बी फर्दर सब क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ द इवेंट्स, दैट्स नॉट अवर कंसर्न ऑफ स्टडी। ओके, सो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द वैस्कुलर चेंजेस। सो पहला वैस्कुलर चेंज जो आता है वो है वैसोकंस्ट्रिक्शन। सो वैसोकंस्ट्रिक्शन इज बेसिकली द कंस्ट्रिक्शन ऑफ द ब्लड वेसल्स एज सुन एज द इंजरी और डैमेज टेक प्लेस. It's persist only for a very short duration. It is due to basically the chemicals that are released by the site of damage or the injury. So as soon as the vascular damage or the damage to tissue take place, there is a vasoconstriction which persists only for a very short duration. Followed by the vasoconstriction, we have the vasodilation. So this is a normal blood vessels, but when after the vasoconstriction, there is a dilatation of the blood vessels occur. Due to dilatation, it can lead to the redness due to the increased blood flow, which basically also responsible for the increase in the temperature. Increase in the redness is also called the erythema. Okay, so you have to remember this term because in the future part or the future videos I will bring the erythema word directly and I will not use the word redness. And basically the vasodilation is more prominent in the arterioles as compared to the capillary beds. Or you can basically say vasodilation first occurs in the arterioles as compared to the capillary beds. So this is also an important question, that the vasodilation first observed in the arterioles followed by the capillary beds. Next step is the increased vascular permeability. Suppose if there is a damage, what will happen? There will be vasoconstriction for a very short duration followed by the vasodilation. Okay, when the vasodilation occurs, there is increased gap in the between the two endothelial cells, which will lead to the increased vascular permeability. This increased vascular permeability is the most characteristic feature of the acute inflammation. Vasodilation or the vasoconstriction or stasis can occur in other causes or the other types of phenomena, but increased vascular permeability is the most characteristic feature of the acute inflammation. So if the increased vascular permeability is basically due to different mechanisms that we will be studying, but if there is increased vascular permeability, it basically leads to the increase in the gap between the two endothelial cells. So all the fluid which is present along with cells or proteins will leak out into the surrounding tissue. So all the tissue which like fluid or the plasma which was present along with certain cells and proteins will leak out into the surrounding tissue. So basically the fluid will be in the surrounding tissue, the fluid which will be present will be reaching the cells and the proteins, which will lead to the swelling or edema. See, this fluid is called the exudate. Exudate is a fluid or the tissue fluid which is rich in cells and proteins. There is one more fluid which is called the transudate, which is in which the cellular content or the protein content is very less. These two differences we will discuss in detail in a separate video, but meanwhile you should know the fluid or the which is present in the tissue is basically the exudate in case of the inflammation. because the fluid which is leaking is rich in both the cells as well as the proteins, and it will lead to the swelling or edema, which was called the tumor by Celsus. As the Celsus defined the cardinal features of inflammation, which was rubor, calor, dolor, and tumor. Rubor and calor, you can see here, redness and increase in temperature is basically due to the vasodilation, the first two cardinal features, and the third cardinal feature was the tumor, which is due to the increased vascular permeability, by which the fluid which is present inside the blood vessels is leaking into the tissues, and which is rich in cells and proteins. That's why we call it exudate, and it will lead to the swelling or edema, which was called as tumor by the Celsus. And the mechanism of the increased vascular permeability, we have a number of mechanisms that may be by the endothelial cell contraction, direct endothelial cell injury, endothelial cell retraction, or the endothelial cell damage. Endothelial cell contraction basically means the cells will contract, which will increase the gap between the two cells. Keep in mind, the most common mechanism responsible for increased vascular permeability is the endothelial cell contraction. It is the immediate transient response, means it occurs immediately. This response immediately lead to the increased vascular permeability, but it lasts only for a very short duration. Example includes the thorn prick. Direct endothelial cell injury is other mechanism, which is immediate sustained response, means it will immediately lead to the increased vascular permeability, but it also will persist for a longer duration. Example include the severe burn or septicemia, in which there is increased bacterial load in our body. Endothelial cell retraction is other mechanism, which is responsible for the delayed transient response, means the response will occur late, but it will be for a very short duration. Example include the bacterial infection. Endothelial cell damage is the last mechanism, which leads to a delayed prolonged leakage. Example include the late sunburn. So you have to keep all this mechanism in mind, and the most important being the endothelial cell contraction, which is the most common mechanism responsible for the increased vascular permeability. Next changes in the vascular part is the stasis. See, stasis basically means the decreased blood flow. Whenever there is increased vascular permeability, the fluid will leak out from the blood vessel into the surrounding tissue, which will lead to the increased heme concentration or concentration of the cellular blood content or the blood cells, that is the RBC or the WBC, and basically which will lead to the decreased blood flow or the stasis. Stasis is basically due to the increased vascular permeability or the previous event of the vascular change. See, blood leukocytes accumulate along the vascular endothelium when stasis occurs. So stasis is responsible for the accumulation of the neutrophils along the vascular endothelium. So now let us recap all the vascular changes that we have studied till now. So suppose whenever there is damage, there will be a very short duration, there will be vasoconstriction, followed by vasodilation. Vasodilation will lead to two cardinal features, that was the redness or erythema, which is called the rubor, and increase in temperature, which is called the calor. Vasodilation is followed by the increased vascular permeability, which will lead to the accumulation of the fluid in the surrounding tissue, and which will lead to the swelling or the tumor. And the fluid is also called exudate because it is rich in protein in the cells. And increased vascular permeability will be followed by the stasis, as the increased vascular permeability will lead to the hemoconcentration or increase in the concentration of the cellular components of the blood, and which will lead to the stasis. Stasis helps in the accumulation of the neutrophils or the leukocytes along the endothelium. Actually, what happens, if you look at the cross section of a blood vessel, you will find the RBCs are present in the center, or they flow in the central part, and the neutrophils are concentrated along the periphery, or you can see the WBCs are concentrated along the periphery. So this process is further improved by the stasis. That is basically the increase in the hemoconcentration, which will basically lead to the decreased blood flow or decrease in the speed of blood in that particular area of the cell damage. So these were the changes in the vascular part or the blood vessels. Now we'll look at the cellular changes that occurs. So next, cellular changes, as I told you, we are divided